A single mother gave her last $10 to a homeless man on a Chicago street corner. Not her spare change, not what she could afford. Her last $10, the bus fare home. The only thing standing between her and a 7-year-old waiting by the window on the south side. She didn't hesitate, didn't look around, didn't calculate what she was giving up. She just gave it. The billionaire who owned that building watched her do it. He didn't call security. He didn't go back to his meeting. He didn't look away. He put on his coat and took the elevator down. What he found at street level, 9 floors below the window he'd looked out of every morning for 12 years, on the same block he'd rebuilt from the ground up, wasn't what he expected. And what that woman gave away on a cold Chicago morning turned out to be worth more than anything on the 22nd floor. If you've ever given something you couldn't afford to give and never knew what happened after, stay with me. Subscribe if you're new here, and tell me where you're watching from, because I read every comment. And I think this one's going to stay with you. Sarah Mitchell woke up at 4:47 in the morning, not because of an alarm, because Emma coughed. She lay completely still in the dark and listened. One small cough, dry, then silence. Then the slow return of her daughter's breathing, steady and even, no whistle at the edges. She counted to 10 before she let herself exhale. That was how Sarah Mitchell started every single day. Not with a phone alarm, not with coffee already brewing. With the sound of her daughter's lungs, reading them like a forecast. Clear or cloudy, normal morning or emergency room morning. Emma had asthma. Mild, the doctor said. Mild. Sarah had learned, over 3 years with that word, that mild means something very different, depending on which side of the examination table you're sitting on. On the doctor's side, mild means manageable. Means here's a prescription, we'll check in at your next visit. On Sarah's side, mild meant listening for breathing at 4:47 in the morning, because she was the only adult in that apartment, and if something went wrong, there was no one else. She dressed in the dark. Green uniform shirt, store logo over the left breast, black pants with a tear at the right knee. She'd sewn closed twice already. The jacket she'd bought from a thrift store 3 years ago. The inner lining had separated at one corner, and every Chicago morning found that gap at her left wrist and reminded her it was there. She pulled the sleeve down. She'd been pulling that sleeve down for 3 years. She didn't turn the bathroom light on. She knew this room by touch. Toothbrush, second shelf, left side. Emma's inhaler, right side, exactly where it needed to be so she could find it at 3 a.m. in the dark without thinking. She had found it at 3 a.m. before. She would find it again. In the kitchen, she opened her wallet under the small light above the stove. $47. She already knew the number. She'd known since yesterday when she'd put $12 on Emma's school lunch account and watched the wallet go from $59 to $47 and recalculated everything automatically, the way she always recalculated, the way the math never stopped running. $47. Bus fare to work and back, 10 eats, leave $7. But rent, $780 due Friday. Electric bill, $94. Second notice already on the counter. Emma's inhaler refill needed by Wednesday, $68 with the coupon she'd saved 3 weeks, $89 without it. She looked at the $47 for a moment. Then she closed the wallet and put her jacket on. The math didn't have a good answer. It hadn't had a good answer in a long time. At some point, in the last 6 years, Sarah Mitchell had stopped needing the math to have a good answer. She just needed an answer she could work with for one more day. Today's answer, $37. Work with it. She had worked with worse. Outside, Chicago in November. 4 degrees below zero, wind off Lake Michigan, cutting down the side streets with no patience for anyone standing between it and wherever it was going. She walked with her head down, hands in her pockets, left sleeve pulled over the gap in the lining. 1 block, 2 blocks. She passed a coffee shop just opening, the smell reaching out onto the sidewalk like a hand extended in greeting. She didn't go in. $4 for coffee was $4 that had other places to be. The bus was 3 minutes late. She stood at the stop with 2 other people who didn't speak. All 3 of them turned slightly away from the wind, waiting with the specific patience of people who have learned that complaining changes nothing. She pulled out her phone on the bus, not to scroll, to check Emma's school app, attendance, meals, any messages from the teacher, all clear. Then the pharmacy app confirmed the coupon was still valid. Then the bank app, $47 in checking, $12 in savings. She looked at that number for exactly as long as she needed to, then closed the app. Some mornings that number sat in her chest like a stone. This was a stone morning. Emma's father had left when Emma was 9 months old. No argument, no speech, no dramatic final night. He simply stopped coming home one Tuesday, and by Sunday, Sarah had moved Emma into the bedroom and set her own bed up in the living room. The living room was smaller. She didn't need much space. She had stood in the kitchen that Sunday and looked at her own hands. 2 hands. Still here. She washed the dishes, made Emma's bottle, and went to sleep at 2 a.m. to wake up at 5. She had been doing it ever since. 6 years of doing it. 6 years of the math that doesn't add up, but you run it anyway because the alternative is not running it. And not running it means not knowing, and not knowing means something getting missed. Emma's inhaler. The second notice on the electric bill. The tear in the knee of the work pants that needed to last another month. Nothing got missed. That was the thing about Sarah Mitchell that most people, looking at her uniform and her worn jacket and her wallet with $47 in it, never understood. She was not surviving in spite of her circumstances. She was running a system inside her circumstances that never stopped, never rested, never missed a detail. She wasn't struggling. She was working. There is a difference, a very large one. And the difference lives in the body, in the way you put your feet down, in whether the tiredness in your legs is the tiredness of someone being dragged or someone moving forward. Sarah Mitchell's tiredness after 6 years was the tiredness of someone moving forward. The shift that day ran 12 hours. One cashier called out sick, another left at 5. And when the manager asked if she could stay, she said yes before he finished the question. Yes was 19 taxes. 19s. 40 was Emma's inhaler with the coupon. She stood behind register 4 for 12 hours. Hello, and did you find everything, and your total is, and have a good night, on repeat, for 12 hours. While her left knee did the thing it did sometimes after hour 8. The dull ache that started just below the kneecap and spread upward if she didn't shift her weight. She shifted her weight. She kept going. At 9:50 p.m., the manager counted out her overtime in cash, 2 tens and some change. She said, "Thank you." She meant neither the gratitude nor the bitterness, just the automatic social machinery of a transaction being completed. Outside, the cold had gotten worse. She stood at the corner of Michigan and Van Buren, and that was when she saw him. He was sitting on the concrete outside the building on the north side of the intersection. Back against the glass, shoulders pulled in. The coat he was wearing was the wrong weight for this night, not dramatically wrong. Not thin enough to stop a passing stranger, just wrong in the specific quiet way of someone wearing what they have rather than what they need. He wasn't asking for anything. No cup, no sign. Just sitting, taking up as little space as he could, waiting for the night to be over. Sarah looked at him, really looked. His shoes first, the right sole separating at the toe, held with a plastic twist tie. His hands, large, rough, the specific shape of knuckles that come from years of physical work. His face. Not a man who had given up, a man who was still here. She knew the difference. She had worn both faces at different points in the last 6 years. She opened her wallet. The math ran immediately, $40. Minus $10 for the bus home. Leaves 37. Rent Friday. Inhaler Wednesday. Second notice on the counter. The math had a very clear answer. Sarah set the math aside. She took the $10 bill. Not change, not something easy to absorb, the only $10 in her wallet, the bus fare home, and walked to where he was sitting and held it out. He looked up. His eyes were clear and fully present. "Thank you," he said. Low, direct, no performance in it. "It's a cold night," she said. She kept walking. 7 kilometers home through 4 degrees below zero. Wind finding the gap at her left wrist every few minutes. Her left knee starting to talk to her somewhere around block 9. She counted the blocks. She did not regret it. Not one step. Not one cold breath. Not one moment of the ache in her knee or the wind at her wrist. Not once. Because she had learned, in 6 years of running math that didn't add up, that there are things the math can measure and things it cannot. And the gap between those two categories, the space where the math runs out and something else takes over, that gap was where she actually lived, where she had always lived. Mrs. Collins was asleep in the armchair when she got home at 11:47. Emma was breathing steadily in the bedroom, the small sound of it reaching Sarah from the hallway. She stood in the kitchen. put the kettle on, sat down at the table, and for the first time in 14 hours, she stopped running numbers. Her wallet was empty except for coins and a pharmacy coupon. She sat with that for a moment. The empty wallet, the warm kitchen, the sound of her daughter breathing normally in the next room. This was the thing Sarah Mitchell had learned that couldn't be taught in any classroom and didn't appear in any of the math she ran every morning under the kitchen light. You could give your last $10 and still be standing. You could give the thing that cost you the most and discover on the other side of the giving that you were not smaller for it. You were exactly the same size. Still here, still enough. Emma's shoes by the front door. The left one with the sole starting to separate at the toe, the same as the man on the corner. Sarah looked at them for a moment. Then she got up, found the super glue in the junk drawer, and fixed the sole before she went to bed. Marcus Webb did not always sit on concrete. That is the first thing you need to understand about the man Sarah Mitchell saw that night. Because the story of how a person ends up on a sidewalk at 10 o'clock on a November night in Chicago is never the story most people assume it is when they walk past without stopping. It is never a simple story, and it is almost never the person's fault in the way that people who walk past need it to be. Marcus Webb had been a structural engineer for 22 years. Not a laborer, not a contractor in the loose sense of the word, a licensed structural engineer who understood load-bearing mathematics the way musicians understand chord progressions, not as formulas to be looked up, but as a language he thought in, dreamed in, read in the bones of every building he walked past. He had grown up in Englewood, the same South Side neighborhood, where his father had worked as a pipe fitter for 30 years and his mother had run a small alteration shop out of their front room until her eyes gave out. They were not wealthy. They were not comfortable in the way that word gets used in real estate listings. But they were stable, which is a different thing entirely. And stability, Marcus had come to understand only after losing it, was the most valuable thing a family could have, and the thing most invisible until it was gone. He put himself through the University of Illinois at Chicago on a combination of scholarships, work study, and the kind of stubborn refusal to quit that his mother called hard-headedness, and that his engineering professors called exceptional persistence. He graduated in 1988. He worked for a large firm for 8 years, learned everything they would teach him, and in 1996 took out a small business loan and opened Webb Structural Engineering on the second floor of a building on 35th Street. 2 employees, 1 drafting table, a phone that rang more than he'd expected in the first month and more again in the second. He was good. Not good the way people say good when they mean adequate. Good the way clients called him back, good the way referrals came unsolicited, good the way younger engineers who worked for him stayed because they were learning something they couldn't learn anywhere else. By 2003, Webb Structural had 12 employees and a reputation across Chicago's construction community as the firm you called when the project was complicated, when the site was difficult, when the margins for error were small. Marcus had built his name on the South Side first. Projects in neighborhoods where the big downtown firms didn't bother to compete, and then expanded north and west as the work followed the reputation. He had an office, a real one, not a desk in a shared space, windows facing east. A drafting table he still used by hand even after CAD software made it technically unnecessary, because there was something about putting a pencil to paper that kept him honest about the math. He had a wife, Denise. They had met at a church social in 1994 and married in 1997 in a ceremony that her mother cried through start to finish, and that Marcus still thought about on certain quiet evenings as the best day of his adult life. He had a son, Andre, born 1999, smart in the specific electric way of children who absorb everything around them and never stop asking why. He had a house in Bronzeville, not large, not grand, but his, the kind of house a man who grew up in Englewood with a pipe fitter father and a seamstress mother could look at and understand, in the most concrete possible terms, what 20 years of showing up had built. He had poured the back patio himself, not because he couldn't afford to hire someone, because he wanted to know what he was standing on. In 2005, Callaway Group put out a request for structural engineering proposals on a major mixed-use development in the South Loop. 600 units of residential, retail on the ground floor, underground parking, complex foundation requirements due to the site's proximity to the river. It was the largest project Marcus had ever bid on. He worked on the proposal for 3 weeks, came in competitive on price, detailed on methodology, specific about the site challenges and how he intended to address them. He won the contract. Denise opened a bottle of champagne the night he told her. Andre, 6 years old, didn't understand exactly what had happened, but understood that his parents were happy and danced around the kitchen in his pajamas until they made him go to bed. Marcus signed the contract in the spring of 2006. He hired 4 additional engineers to handle the workload. He ordered materials. He moved the project forward. In October 2008, the American financial system collapsed. Not slowly, not with adequate warning for the people at the bottom of the chain. Quickly, the way structural failures happen when the foundation has been compromised for years, and nobody with the power to inspect it chose to look. And then, one day, the weight becomes too much, and everything comes down at once. Callaway Group froze the South Loop project in the first week of November 2008. Marcus had spent $340,000, materials, labor, equipment rental. All of it paid up front because that was what the contract required. The subcontractor demonstrates financial commitment before breaking ground. The next payment from Callaway was due in December. It never came. The contract contained a force majeure clause on page 17. Marcus had read page 17. His attorney had read page 17. The clause was standard, the attorney said. Boiler plate. It almost never gets invoked. Almost. December, January, February. The calls to Callaway's offices were routed to a legal department that responded by mail, in language that cited page 17 and expressed regret for the circumstances, and wished Webb Structural Engineering well in its future endeavors. March. The 4 engineers he had hired needed to be paid. He paid them. April. The bank note on the equipment came due. He paid it. May. The business loan he'd taken to cover the materials gap. He began to miss payments. June 2009. He let the 4 engineers go. 2 weeks severance each, because he had told them when he hired them that if anything went wrong, he would give them 2 weeks. He owed them more than 2 weeks. He could only afford 2 weeks. He sat in his office after the last one left and looked at the drafting table by the window, the pencil still on the tray, the drawings still tacked to the board, the South Loop project, the foundation plans, the careful, precise mathematics of a building that was never going to be built. He took the drawings down, rolled them carefully, put them in a tube. He didn't throw them away. He still doesn't know exactly why. August 2009. In Bronzeville. He and Denise sat at the kitchen table where Andre did his homework, where they ate Sunday dinners, where Marcus had once spread out project drawings to show Denise what he was building, and talked about what was left and what wasn't and what came next. Denise was not cold about it. She was not cruel. She was the same woman he had married in 1997, the one her mother had cried through the ceremony for, and she sat across that table and looked at him with the eyes of someone trying to find a floor in a room that was still falling. They sold the house in September. Marcus stood in the back patio on the last morning, before the new owners arrived. He put his hand flat on the concrete he had poured himself, pressed down, felt the solidity of it, still there. It would still be there long after he was gone. That was the thing about concrete. It outlasted everything. The marriage, the company. The version of himself who had mixed that concrete and poured it and smoothed it level on a summer Saturday while Denise brought him water, and Andre sat on the back steps and watched his father work. He stood up. He left. He did not allow himself to look back at the patio. Denise and Andre moved to her sister's place in Indianapolis in October. It was the practical decision. Her sister had space. Andre needed stability, needed school, needed a floor under him that wasn't still falling. Marcus understood. He told Andre the morning they drove away. Andre, 10 years old, quiet in the back seat, trying to be brave in the way children try to be brave when they sense the adults around them are breaking. He told him, "You're going to be all right. Your mother's going to take care of you. You're going to be all right." Andre nodded, didn't cry. watched his father through the back window as the car pulled away. Marcus watched the car until he couldn't see it anymore. Then he went back inside the empty house that was no longer his house and sat on the floor of the kitchen where they had eaten Sunday dinners, where Andre had done his homework, where Marcus had spread out the South Loop drawings, and he sat there until it got dark. He didn't cry either. He just sat. The years that followed did not arrive dramatically. That is the thing about this kind of falling. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens the way a building with a compromised foundation settles. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first. The doors stick. The windows don't close right. The floors are no longer quite level. And then one day you notice the walls are cracked. Contract work, when he could find it. Day labor, when he couldn't. A room in a boarding house on the west side for 2 years. Then a shelter bed when the boarding house raised rates past what day labor could cover. The shelter had rules. Check out by 7, no guaranteed bed the next night. He learned the system, learned which shelters had space on which nights, learned which churches served meals on which days, learned the specific functional geography of survival in a city he had once navigated as a professional, a business owner, a man with a drafting table and a window facing east. He kept the leather wallet. Brown, worn at the edges, the stitching loose on one side. Inside it, a library card, a folded piece of paper with phone numbers written in his careful engineer's handwriting, and a membership card from the Illinois Structural Engineering Society, expired in 2009. He had been asked more than once why he kept it. He never had a clean answer, maybe because the card had his name on it. Marcus A. Webb, licensed professional engineer. And even on the nights when the floor was concrete and the ceiling was open sky, the name was still his. The license was still real, even if it had lapsed. The 22 years of knowing how buildings worked, understanding load and stress, and the mathematics of structures that were built to last, that was still in him, still there. The same way the patio in Bronzeville was still there. You could take almost everything. You couldn't take what a person knew. He also kept a notebook, small, spiral-bound, bought from a dollar store on Milwaukee Avenue in 2011. The pages were full now. Both sides, small, careful handwriting, the same handwriting that had once filled engineering drawings, numbers, dates, names of agencies, notes from conversations with caseworkers and shelter directors, and the people he met in lines and waiting rooms and sidewalks across 13 years of navigating a system that was, he had come to understand in the specific way of someone who had studied systems his whole professional life, not broken, working exactly as designed. The design was the problem. On the night Sarah Mitchell saw him, Marcus Webb was 58 years old. He had been without permanent housing for 3 years. Not continuously, not every single night, but 3 years of no address, no lease, no key that opened a door that was reliably his. The corner of Michigan and Van Buren was not where he usually sat. He had ended up there that evening because the shelter on the north side where he'd been staying was at capacity, and the next closest option was a church on the south side that didn't open until midnight, and it was 10 o'clock, and it was 4 degrees below zero. And the building on the corner had a glass wall that blocked the wind from the east. That was it. Not a choice. A calculation. The same kind of calculation in its own way that Sarah Mitchell made every morning under the kitchen light. You work with what you have. You find the warmest wall. You wait for the night to be over. He heard her stop before he saw her. The specific sound of footsteps that slow, then halt. Different from the footsteps that keep moving, that treat the space around him like geography, to be navigated rather than a place where a person is. He looked up. A woman in a green uniform and an old jacket, standing in front of him with her wallet open. He looked at her face. Not pity on it. He knew pity. He had learned to recognize it in the first half second of eye contact. The slight softening that was really a kind of distance. The expression that was performing concern while simultaneously confirming to itself that this could never happen to me. This was not that. This was something he recognized from a different context entirely. From job sites, from difficult projects, from the specific look of someone who has assessed a situation quickly and accurately and is deciding what to do about it with the information they actually have, rather than the information they wish they had. She had looked at him and seen him, not the circumstances, him. She held out the $10. He took it. Thank you, he said. It's a cold night, she said. She kept walking. Marcus looked at the $10 bill in his hand. Then he looked at the building rising above him. 22 floors of glass and steel and polished lobby. The kind of building he had once helped design. The kind of mathematics he had once lived inside professionally. The kind of structure he could still read like a language even now. Even here. Even sitting on the concrete outside it. He knew this building. Not personally. Professionally. He had studied the foundation specs once, years ago, in a different life, when someone had shared the engineering drawings at an industry event, and he had stood at the display table and read them the way other people read menus, easily, with pleasure, understanding every choice that had been made. Good work. Solid. Built to last. He folded the $10 bill and put it in the old leather wallet, next to the expired engineering card. He looked up at the tower, 22 floors. From up there, the street would look like a diagram. Clean lines, predictable flows. The efficient movement of a city that worked. He had lived in that diagram once. He was living in the street now. Both were real. The building didn't know the difference. James Calloway arrived at his office at 7 o'clock every morning, not because he had to, because the city looked different at 7. By 9, Chicago was fully itself, loud, certain, performing the version of itself that appeared in magazines and tourism campaigns, and the kind of architectural photography that made buildings look like they had always been exactly where they were and always would be. By 9, the city knew it was being watched and behaved accordingly. At 7, it was still half asleep. The loop not yet at full volume. The streets below carrying only the people who had somewhere specific to be and no patience for anything that slowed them down. The light coming off the lake at a low angle, hitting the glass towers at the angle that made them look. For about 40 minutes every morning, like they were lit from the inside, James had watched that 40 minutes of light from the 22nd floor for 12 years. He had never told anyone that. It was not the kind of thing James Calloway said out loud. He was 61 years old. He had founded Calloway Group in 1993 with a $40,000 personal loan, one assistant, and a specific theory about which Chicago neighborhoods were undervalued and why. The theory had been correct. The $40,000 had become $2, $3 billion over 30 years of correct theories and difficult decisions, and the kind of disciplined, unsentimental focus that the people who worked for him described, depending on whether they were inside or outside his office at the time, as visionary or merciless. Both words were accurate. Both were incomplete. The 22nd floor office was the way offices like his were supposed to look, not designed to impress visitors, though it did, but designed to think in. Floor-to-ceiling glass on the north and east sides. The walnut desk he'd had for 15 years, scarred in specific places where projects had lived and died. A drafting table along the west wall that his architects used when they came up, and that James himself still used sometimes, late at night, when the problem was spatial. And screens weren't enough. On the east wall, between the windows, photographs, 30 years of projects, sites before and after. Buildings that now house thousands of people and businesses across Chicago, Detroit, Atlanta, Houston. The record of what Calloway Group had built, arranged chronologically, starting from a small commercial renovation on the west side in 1993 and running forward through everything that came after. James knew every photograph. Knew the story behind each one, the financing problems, the community opposition, the design compromises, the moments when the project almost didn't happen and then happened anyway because he had pushed through the point where most people stopped pushing. Near the middle of the wall, dated 2006, a rendering of the South Loop development, the one that had been frozen in the crash, the one that had never been built. He didn't look at that photograph often. On the nights he stayed late, which were most nights, James stood at the east window and looked at the city below and ran the version of the math that had occupied the back of his mind for 30 years. What was undervalued? What was coming? Where the next opportunity was? And what it would require? And what would need to be moved to make it possible? He had grown up 6 miles south of where he now stood. 79th Street. A 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building that his mother had described, without irony, as decent, meaning it had heat in winter, and the hallways were lit, and the landlord fixed things within a reasonable time. His mother had worked double shifts at Rush University Medical Center for 23 years, not as a doctor, not as a nurse, as a patient services coordinator, the person who sat at the desk and managed the information flow between patients and the clinical teams, the insurance companies and the billing departments, the person who knew more about how the hospital actually worked than most of the people with titles above her on the organizational chart, and who was paid accordingly, which is to say not well. His father had left before James was old enough to have a clear memory of him. Not dramatically. He simply wasn't there. James had grown up in the specific gravity of a household where everything was precise because it had to be, where money was managed the way a pilot manages fuel. Not because you love numbers, but because running out has consequences you can't afford. His mother had never made him feel poor. That was the thing he thought about when he thought about her, which was more often than he showed in public, and more often, probably, than was useful. She had never made him feel poor. She had made him feel like someone who was working towards something, which is a very different feeling. And the difference had mattered more than he could calculate. He had gone to the University of Chicago on a full scholarship, real estate finance, graduated in 1985, worked for a development firm for 8 years, learned what he needed to learn, and left to start Callaway Group. 30 years, $2.3 billion, 400 employees, 27 completed projects across 4 cities. He looked at those numbers sometimes the way he imagined his mother must have looked at the number in her bank account at the end of each month, with a kind of specific, focused relief that was not quite happiness but was the foundation of it. Not yet. Not done yet. The particular emptiness of succeeding at the thing you set out to do and finding that success is quieter than you expected, that it takes up less space, that the apartment on 79th Street is still in you somewhere, still running its own calculations, still waiting for something to go wrong, still checking for the gap in the line. James had been married once. Patricia. 12 years, 2 children now grown, a divorce in 2009 that had been handled with the same focused efficiency he brought to everything, and that had cost him considerably more than the financial accounting showed. His son was in Seattle, his daughter in New York. They spoke regularly. He was better at it than he used to be. That was the most honest way to put it. He was better at it than he used to be. The office at 7 in the morning was his. His, in the way a thing is yours, when no one else is in it. When the day hasn't started yet and the decisions haven't accumulated, and the city below is still running its quiet early morning version of itself, and the light is doing the thing it did for 40 minutes. That particular night, the night Sarah Mitchell gave away her last $10. The night Marcus Webb sat against his building in a coat too thin for November. James had stayed later than usual. Quarterly projections. The Englewood proposal his team had been developing for 3 months. A conversation with his CFO about 2 projects in Detroit that were running over budget. The specific, accumulated weight of a day in which every conversation had required a decision, and every decision had required him to hold multiple considerations simultaneously without dropping any of them. By 10 o'clock, the floor was empty. The cleaning crew had come and gone. His assistant had left at 7 with the look she always had at the end of long days. Professional composure over genuine exhaustion, maintained perfectly because she was good at her job, and knew he noticed both things. James stood at the east window with a glass of water, not looking at anything in particular, letting his eyes rest on the city below, the way you let your eyes rest on a fire, not seeing, just looking, letting the visual information flow past without grabbing at it. That was when he saw the woman stop. From 22 floors up, people on the street were small. You couldn't see faces. You couldn't read expressions. What you could see was movement, the flow and pattern of it, the specific choreography of a city sidewalk at 10 o'clock on a weeknight, which had its own rhythm distinct from the daytime rhythm, quieter, more purposeful. The people who were out at this hour generally knowing where they were going. He saw her stop, not the gradual slowing of someone checking their phone or looking for a street sign. A complete stop, deliberate. He saw her turn, walk to the side of the building below him, crouch down. He couldn't see what she was doing. From 22 floors, the angle made the base of the building invisible. She had moved into the narrow strip of sidewalk directly against the glass wall, out of his sight line. But he saw her stand up again. And he saw, in the way she stood, the specific set of her shoulders, the brief stillness before she began moving again. That something had happened in the 30 seconds she was out of his sight. Something that was not a transaction. Something that was not a phone call or a dropped item or any of the 100 ordinary reasons a person stops on a sidewalk. She kept walking. East on Van Buren, away from the building, her pace unchanged, not faster, not slower, just the same steady movement she'd had before she stopped, as if what had just happened was a continuation of something rather than an interruption. James watched her until she turned the corner. He looked down at the base of his building. There was someone sitting there. He could see the shape of them now that he was looking, the slight figure against the glass, the stillness that had been there the whole time he'd been standing at this window, invisible until he looked for it. He had been looking at this view for 12 years. He had not been seeing it. He set his glass of water down on the windowsill. He looked at the photograph on the wall, the 2006 South Loop rendering, the project that had been frozen, the project that had generated a $340,000 invoice from a structural engineering firm that had not been paid. The invoice his legal team had handled with the force majeure clause on page 17. Handled. That was the word they had used. Handled. He looked back down at the figure, sitting against the base of his building. From 22 floors, he could not see the face, could not see the worn shoes or the too-thin coat or the old leather wallet in the jacket pocket, could not see the expired engineering card inside the wallet, or the small spiral notebook, or the careful handwriting that had once filled technical drawings, and now filled pages of dates and names, and the specific accumulated record of what the system looked like from the inside. He could see only the stillness, the way a person sits when they have nowhere to go. James Calloway had grown up 6 miles south of this window. He had sat in rooms where the heating didn't work and done homework at a kitchen table by lamplight and watched his mother leave for the hospital at 5 in the morning and understood, in the wordless way children understand the things they live inside, that the distance between where they were and where they needed to get to was real and specific and would require everything he had. He had given everything he had. He had gotten there, and somewhere along the way, he could not have said exactly when, could not have pointed to a specific meeting or decision or morning when it happened. He had stopped looking down, not deliberately, not cruelly. The way you stop looking at anything you stop needing to look at. The way success calcifies, slowly, the way bone does, until you are protected and enclosed, and the view from the window is a diagram of a city that works, and the figure sitting against the glass at the base of your building is invisible because you stopped looking for it. He had built his company on the belief that he saw things other people missed. He had missed this. He looked at the figure for a long time. Then he picked up his coat from the chair, took the elevator down. He pressed the lobby button and listened to the elevator descend, floor 22, 21, 20, and did not allow himself to think about whether this was reasonable or productive or the best use of the next hour of his evening. He had learned 30 years ago that the best decisions didn't always feel reasonable in the moment you made them. They felt necessary. This felt necessary. The elevator opened onto the lobby. The night security guard looked up, registered the CEO, leaving at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday in November, and said good evening with the professional neutrality of someone trained not to express surprise. "Good evening, Robert," James said. He walked through the lobby, pushed through the door, and stepped out into the Chicago cold for the first time all day. The temperature hit him immediately, 4 degrees below zero. The wind off the lake, the specific unfiltered cold of a street-level Chicago November that no window, however large and well-insulated, fully communicated from 22 floors up. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Let the cold be what it was. Then he turned the corner to the north side of the building, and he stopped. Because the man sitting against his building looked up, and James Calloway, who had reviewed the South Loop project files enough times to know the names of every major subcontractor, who had seen the $340 fusioned invoice enough times for the company name to have lodged somewhere in his memory. Web structural engineering. Recognized in the specific way that faces lodge themselves in professional memory, even after 15 years, even in bad light. Even across the distance between a standing man and a man sitting on the ground, he recognized the face. Marcus Webb, the engineer. The man on page 17. James Calloway stood on the sidewalk outside his own building at 10 o'clock on a November night, and for the first time in 30 years of making decisions under pressure, he did not know what to say. James Calloway had not sat on concrete since he was 9 years old. That was the specific memory that came to him as he lowered himself down. Not a general recollection of childhood poverty or the abstract awareness that he had grown up without much. A specific memory. Summer 1971. The stoop outside the building on 79th Street, waiting for his mother to come home from the hospital, the concrete warm from the afternoon sun, the rough texture of it against the back of his legs. He had been 9. He was 61 now. The concrete at the base of his own building was not warm. It was 4 degrees below zero, and the cold came through the wool of his $800 suit pants immediately, efficiently, without ceremony. The way cold had always worked at street level in Chicago, without the mediation of glass or height, or the sealed climate of a 22nd floor office where the temperature never changed. He sat down anyway. Marcus Webb watched him do it. Did not speak, did not shift away, did not perform surprise or gratitude, or any of the things James had unconsciously expected. The things people perform when someone with visible wealth and authority enters their immediate space and does something unexpected. Marcus Webb simply watched him sit down with the evaluating stillness of a man who had been reading situations accurately for a very long time and was reading this one. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The city moved around them. A cab passed on Michigan Avenue. 2 people walked by on the opposite sidewalk without looking over. Somewhere to the north, a truck made a delivery, the hydraulic sound of a loading dock. Chicago at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night. Indifferent. Continuous. The same city at street level as from 22 floors up, and not the same at all. Web structural engineering, James said finally. Not a question. A statement. Placing a name into the air between them like laying a card on a table. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Calloway Group, he said. Same register, same flatness, same laying down of a card. They looked at each other in the inadequate light of the street lamp. I recognized you, James said. From the project files, your firm's proposal was, it was exceptional work. Marcus said nothing. The force majeure, James began. Page 17, Marcus said. I know what page it was on. James stopped. The wind moved between them, finding every gap it could. How much did you lose? James asked. $340,000. No hesitation. The number lived right at the surface, accessible in an instant, the way numbers live when they have cost you everything. Materials, labor, equipment rental, all paid up front. Your contract required demonstrated financial commitment before breaking ground. He paused. I demonstrated it. James looked down at his hands. His hands in $200 gloves, on a sidewalk outside a building he owned, talking to a man in a coat too thin for this weather, about $340,000 that had moved from one side of a balance sheet to the other 15 years ago. I didn't know, James said. You knew the amount, Marcus said. It was on the invoice. I knew the invoice. I didn't. He stopped. Started again. I didn't know what it meant, what it cost. I left it to the legal team and they handled it according to the contract, and I moved on to the next thing. I know, Marcus said. That's how it works. Not bitterly, factually. The same tone a structural engineer uses to describe load-bearing mathematics. Here is the force, here is the structure, here is what happens when the two interact. No judgment in it. Just accuracy. That was the thing that stopped James more completely than anything else Marcus could have said. Not anger, not accusation, just accuracy. The woman who stopped, James said after a moment, before I came out. Did you know her? No. She gave you her bus fare. Marcus looked at him. How do you know that? I saw her stop from upstairs. I couldn't see what happened directly below the building, but I saw how she walked away. He paused. And I've been standing at that window for 12 years, watching people on that sidewalk, and nobody ever stopped like that, not once. Marcus looked at the $10 bill in his hand. He'd been holding it since Sarah placed it there, not from indecision, but from the specific feeling of an object that carries weight beyond its denomination. The weight of what it cost the person who gave it. She didn't hesitate, he said. No. People who don't have anything are the ones who give, Marcus said. That's not a new observation, but it doesn't get less true just because it's old. James looked at the $10 bill. $10. His company's last quarterly profit, $340 million. $10 was what this woman had given. From a wallet that couldn't absorb the loss, to a man sitting on the concrete outside James Calloway's building. He did not say the words that were obvious to say. He understood, in this moment, that the obvious words would be the wrong ones. The words that turned the moment into a transaction, that made it about him and his capacity to remedy and resolve, that replaced the specific human reality of what had just happened with the comfortable vocabulary of philanthropy. He sat on the concrete instead. Let the cold continue to be cold. Tell me what happened, he said, after the project was frozen. All of it. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Why? Because I should have asked 15 years ago. Silence. The city moved around them, indifferent and continuous. $340,000 gone in December 2008, Marcus said finally. By March, I couldn't make payroll. By June, I let the last of my engineers go. By September, I'd sold the house. He said it the way you say things you've said to yourself enough times that the words have worn smooth, not painless. Worn. My wife took my son to Indianapolis. He paused. He's 25 now. We talk sometimes. James heard that word and understood everything inside it. The company, Marcus continued. You can't restart a structural engineering firm without capital, without equipment, without a team. I tried. 2010, 2011, contract work. Day labor to cover costs between contracts. The contracts got smaller. The gaps between them got longer. He looked at his hands. I'm still a licensed engineer. My license lapsed in 2009, but I could reinstate it. The knowledge doesn't go away. The math is still there. He tapped his temple. All of it. Still there. James looked at those hands. The hands of a structural engineer. The hands of a man who had poured his own back patio because he wanted to know what he was standing on, sitting on the concrete outside a building that someone with those hands had once analyzed and understood from the inside out. You kept your notebook, James said, noticing it for the first time. The small, spiral-bound notebook Marcus had been holding when he came around the corner. I keep records, Marcus said. Old habit. What's in it? Marcus looked at the notebook for a moment, then he held it out. James took it carefully. He opened it to a random page. The handwriting was small and precise, an engineer's handwriting, the kind trained by years of labeling drawings where clarity was not optional. Dates, agency names, amounts, notes from conversations with caseworkers, shelter directors, legal aid offices. The specific accumulated record of someone who had been navigating a complex system and documenting every interaction with the methodical accuracy of a professional who understood that the data mattered. He turned to the front. November 2009, first entry. He turned to the back. Last entry. 2 days ago. A note about the shelter on the north side being at capacity. The church on the south side that opened at midnight. The calculation of time and distance and temperature that had produced this specific corner on this specific night. James closed the notebook carefully. He held it for a moment. Then he held it back out. You've been documenting this, he said, for 13 years. Someone should, Marcus said. Nobody else was going to. James looked at the notebook in Marcus's hands. Worn cover, pages dense with precise handwriting, 13 years of a system recorded from the inside by the person the system had processed. He thought about the quarterly report on his desk upstairs. $340 million profit. Clean numbers. Every line item accounted for and categorized and presented in the language that made complexity manageable, that turned the specific human reality of what a company did and didn't do into a format that could be reviewed in 45 minutes by people in a conference room. And he thought about this notebook. Same period, roughly. Different accounting. I'm going to ask you something, James said. And I need you to answer it the way you'd answer an engineering question, not the way you'd answer a man who owns the building you're sitting against. Marcus said nothing, waited. What's wrong with the system? James said. Specifically. The way a structural would say what's wrong with a building. Not the politics of it, the actual load-bearing failures. Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but the specific recognition of someone hearing a question asked in their own language for the first time in a very long time. He opened the notebook. First failure, he said, his voice taking on the precise, organized quality of a man returning to professional mode. The mode that had never left him, just gone unused. Contract structures that transfer financial risk exclusively downward in the supply chain. Large developers absorb market shocks through force majeure clauses. Small subcontractors absorb the cost. The structure is designed to protect capital at the top by exposing it at the bottom. James said nothing. Second failure, Marcus continued. No recovery mechanism. When a small business fails due to a contracted project being frozen, not due to negligence, not due to poor work, due to market conditions outside their control, there is no pathway back. SBA loans require credit history. Credit history requires continuous operation. Continuous operation requires capital. The loop is closed. He turned a page. Third failure. Housing. He looked up. You're a developer. You know the Chicago housing market. You know what happened to affordable stock in the South Loop, in Pilsen, in Woodlawn, in every neighborhood where your projects and projects like yours replaced lower-income housing with higher-income housing without mandatory replacement ratios. He wasn't accusing. He was describing. When I lost the house in Bronzeville, there was nowhere in a reasonable distance to land. The neighborhoods I could have afforded 10 years earlier were no longer what they had been. The displacement happened so gradually that it didn't look like displacement. It looked like market forces. It was market forces, James said. Market forces are not natural phenomena, Marcus said. They are the result of policy decisions, zoning, tax incentives, which projects get approved and which don't. Market forces are designed. The design has consequences. He paused. The consequences are people like me, sitting on concrete outside buildings like yours. The wind moved between them. James sat on the concrete of his own sidewalk and felt the cold working its way through the wool of his suit pants and thought about 30 years of projects and decisions and quarterly reports and the specific accumulated gap between the language he used to describe what his company did and what his company actually did. The language was not wrong. The language was incomplete. You said the knowledge is still there, James said finally. The engineering. Yes, all of it. Every load calculation I've ever done is still in my head, Marcus said. I could walk into any structural engineering project in this city tomorrow and contribute from the first day. The knowledge doesn't atrophy the way physical skills do. It stays. He looked at his hands. The hands are still good too, for that matter. James looked at those hands. Then he looked up at the 22nd floor of his building. The light in his office was still on. His desk still up there with the quarterly report and the Englewood proposal and the photograph of the South Loop project that had never been built. Page 17. $340,000. 13 years. A structural engineer sitting on the concrete outside his building with a notebook full of 13 years of precise documentation that no one had ever asked to read. He had asked. He was reading it. The question now was what he was going to do with what he'd read. That question didn't have an answer yet. But James Calloway had spent 30 years understanding that the moment a question became unavoidable was the moment it had actually begun to be answered. He sat on the concrete a while longer. The cold continued to be cold. Neither of them spoke for several minutes, and in that silence something shifted. Not dramatically, not with ceremony, just the specific, quiet shift of two people sitting on the same level for the first time. The same concrete, the same temperature, the same city, same ground. James found Sarah the next morning, not through surveillance, not through the building's security footage. Though he had access to it, and the thought had crossed his mind, and he had decided against it in the elevator, going back up the previous night, because using a camera to find a woman who had given away her bus fare felt like exactly the wrong way to start whatever this was. He found her the right way. He went downstairs at 6:30 in the morning and stood outside the building and waited. He didn't know if she would come back. He didn't know if she worked in his building or had simply been passing. He knew only that she had stopped in front of this building, on this corner. and that the odds were reasonable that she passed this corner regularly. He waited. At 7:14, he saw her. Green uniform, old jacket. The left sleeve pulled down over her wrist, moving at the same steady pace he had watched from 22 floors the night before. Not fast, not slow. Exactly the speed of someone who knows where they're going and has calculated precisely how long it takes to get there. She didn't see him until she was almost at the door. When she did, she stopped. Not the surprised stop of someone startled. The careful stop of someone who has learned to read situations quickly and is reading this one. A man in an expensive coat standing outside a building at 7 in the morning, looking at her with the kind of focused attention that required explanation. "I'm not here to cause a problem," James said immediately. He had thought about what to say and had decided that the most important thing was to establish that first, before anything else. "My name is James Calloway. I own this building. I was at my window last night." She looked at him. Her expression did not change the way he expected it to. He had expected surprise. He had expected some version of the reaction most people had when they understood who they were talking to. The recalibration, the slight shift in posture, the performance of being fine while processing the information. Sarah Mitchell looked at him the way she had looked at Marcus Webb on the concrete the night before. Just looked, reading what was actually there. "The man on the corner," she said. "Is he all right?" James blinked. That was her first question. Not "who are you?" Not "what do you want?" Not any version of a question about herself. "Is he all right?" "He's..." James stopped. He had arranged for Marcus to go to a hotel 2 blocks north the previous night, had called ahead and given his credit card number over the phone and walked Marcus there himself before going back upstairs. It had taken 40 minutes. It was not a solution. It was one night. "He's warm," James said. "For now." Sarah nodded. Something in her face settled. "Do you have a few minutes?" James asked. "There's a coffee shop on the next block." She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her watch. "I start at 8, she said. "I have 20 minutes. They sat at a corner table. James ordered 2 coffees without asking what she wanted, then caught himself and looked at her. "Sorry," he said. "What would you like?" "Coffee is fine," she said. "Black." He appreciated the directness. He appreciated, he realized, almost everything about how she occupied space with no performance in it, no adjustment for who she was sitting across from, no version of herself constructed for the audience. She sat across from James Calloway the way she had stood in front of Marcus Webb the night before. Just herself, fully present. "Last night," James said, "what you gave him, that's not why I'm here," Sarah said. "I know. I'm asking because..." "I gave him $10, she said. "It was cold. He was there. I had it." She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. "That's the whole story. It was your bus fare home." She looked at him steadily. "Yes. You walked 7 kilometers in 4-degree weather." "I know how far I walked." James looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Put the observation down." "The man on the corner," he said. "His name is Marcus Webb. 15 years ago, he was a structural engineer. His firm had a contract with my company, a major project in the South Loop. When the market crashed in 2008, we invoked a force majeure clause that left him holding $340,000 in costs that were never reimbursed." Sarah said nothing. "He lost his company," James continued. "His house, his marriage. His son grew up in another city." He paused. "He's been without permanent housing for 3 years." Sarah looked at her coffee. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. It was the right question. James had been asking himself the same thing since the elevator going back up the previous night, and the answer he had arrived at was not the clean, strategic one he was accustomed to producing. "Because you stopped," he said. "I've been in that office for 12 years. I've looked out that window every morning. Not once did I see someone stop the way you stopped." He paused. "I need to understand what you saw." Sarah looked up at him. "What I saw," she repeated. "What made you stop? What you looked at? What made you give him the only $10 you had?" She was quiet for a moment. "I looked at his hands," she said finally. "They were working hands. The kind you get from years of doing something real." She paused. "I looked at his face. He wasn't gone. Some people on the street, you can see, they've gone somewhere inside themselves, where the cold can't reach them anymore. He hadn't done that. He was still there, still present." She looked at her coffee. I know what it costs to stay present when everything is telling you to go somewhere else. James said nothing. And he wasn't asking for anything, she said. That was the other thing. No cup. No sign. Just sitting there existing, trying to get through the night. There's a kind of dignity in that. In just still being here, still trying. She looked up. I recognized it. 2 words. James sat with them for a moment. You said you know what it costs to stay present, he said carefully. I'm a single mother working a 12-hour shift, she said. I have $37 to last until Friday. My daughter has asthma, and her inhaler runs out next Wednesday. She said it without drama, without the performance of hardship, with the same matter-of-fact accuracy Marcus had used to describe load-bearing failures. I'm not comparing myself to him. His situation is harder. But I know what it is to do the math every morning and find that the math doesn't have a good answer and go to work anyway. James looked at her across the table. He thought about the $47 in her wallet the night before. He thought about Emma's inhaler. He thought about 12 hours behind a cash register in a building he owned. He thought about 12 years of looking out a window at street level and not seeing what was there. I'd like to do something, James said. For Marcus, for you. Not as charity. I don't need anything from you, Sarah said, directly, not unkindly. I know, James said. That's not what I'm offering. He paused, making sure the next words were the right ones. I'm offering to fix something that I broke. With Marcus, that's a debt, a real one. $340,000 in 15 years, and a structural engineer sitting on the concrete outside my building. He looked at her. What I want to offer you is different. I want to offer you the thing nobody ever offered either of you. Someone asking what you actually need, not assuming. Asking. Sarah looked at him for a long moment. The coffee shop moved around them. The morning crowd building, the sound of the espresso machine, the specific ambient noise of a city coming fully awake. She looked at her watch. 8 minutes until her shift. I need my daughter's inhaler covered, she said. Every month, not once. Every month. A consistent, reliable source for her medication, so I stopped doing the math every Wednesday about whether we have enough. James nodded. I need a living wage, she said. I work 12 hours in your building. I can't afford the bus home. She held his gaze. That's not a personal failing. That's a policy decision someone made. And it can be unmade. James was quiet. And Marcus, she said, what he needs is not money. He told me that himself in 30 seconds last night. She paused. He needs a floor, a real one. Not a hotel for one night. A floor he can build from. James looked at her. How did he tell you that in 30 seconds? He said. You spoke for 30 seconds. Sarah looked at him steadily. I listened to the 30 seconds I had. They met with Marcus that afternoon. James arranged it, called the hotel, left a message, gave a time in a coffee shop 2 blocks south. Marcus was there when they arrived, sitting at a corner table with the spiral notebook on the table in front of him, his old leather wallet beside it, the expired engineering card visible through the worn leather. James had brought 2 people with him, his director of development, who had 20 years of experience in Chicago construction, and whose face, when Marcus began talking, went through a series of expressions that James had never seen on it before. The specific expression of a professional encountering another professional who knows more about a subject than they expected, and his director of HR. The conversation lasted 3 hours. Not a conversation, really. A deposition. Marcus opened the notebook, and they went through it. 13 years of documented experience with Chicago's housing and workforce systems, recorded with the precision of a licensed engineer who understood that data was only useful if it was accurate. Every failure point named, every gap in the system identified, every place where policy had produced a result that the policy's authors, if they were being honest, had not intended or had intended and preferred not to examine too closely. James's development director took 6 pages of notes. His HR director took 3. When they finished, Marcus closed the notebook. He looked at James. What happens now? He asked. Same question. Different context. The question he had not been able to ask 15 years ago in a legal letter routed through a department that responded with page 17. This time there was someone across the table to answer it. James looked at his 2 directors. Then at Sarah, who had sat through 3 hours of the conversation with the same focused attention she brought to everything. Present, reading what was actually there, not performing anything. Then at Marcus. Now, James said, we build something, not a speech, not a press release. Just 3 words that meant what they said. The notebook had 847 pages. James Calloway counted them that night. Sitting at his kitchen table, not the walnut desk on the 22nd floor, his actual kitchen table in the condo on the 43rd floor of a building 6 blocks north. The one with the kitchen he used mainly for coffee and the dining table that seated 8 and had seated 8 exactly twice in 3 years. He had asked Marcus if he could borrow the notebook overnight. Marcus had looked at him for a long moment before handing it over. Not hesitation, assessment. The specific look of someone deciding whether to trust a thing they cannot afford to lose. I'll bring it back tomorrow, James said. I know you will, Marcus said, which was not the same thing as saying he wasn't calculating the risk. James sat at the kitchen table with the notebook and read it the way he had not read anything in years. Not scanning for actionable data, not filtering for relevance, not applying the executive function of a man who processes large volumes of information daily and has learned to move quickly through most of it. He read slowly. Every page. November 2009. First entry. Web Structural Engineering officially dissolved. Filed the paperwork himself. Notes on the process, the specific bureaucratic sequence of ending a business, the fees involved, the forms, the signatures required. Clinical. Precise. The handwriting of a man keeping himself functional by staying in engineer mode even as his company ceased to exist. Notes on job applications. 47 structural engineering firms contacted. 11 responses. 4 interviews. 0 offers. Notes on each interview, what went well, what didn't, the specific language interviewers used when they were trying to be kind about not hiring someone whose firm had failed. Language, like overqualified and looking for a different profile, and will keep your resume on file. Overqualified, 15 years of experience in a company that had built a reputation across Chicago's South Side as the firm you called for the complicated projects. Overqualified. First mention of the shelter system. Notes on the intake process, forms required, documentation needed, the specific catch-22 of needing an address to get benefits and needing benefits to get an address. Marcus had drawn a diagram in the margin. A closed loop, arrows going in circles. The kind of diagram a structural engineer draws when they're trying to understand a system, not to judge it, to map it. The map showed nowhere to go, a note that stood out. Met a woman at the shelter on Mass Ave named Dorothy, 64, former bookkeeper. Lost her apartment when her employer went under, and she lost the health insurance that covered her diabetes medication. Without the medication, she couldn't maintain the employment that would have let her keep the apartment. Same loop. Different starting point. I've now met 14 people who ended up here through variations of the same sequence. A single destabilizing event. Job loss, medical crisis, death of a spouse, followed by a system with no mechanism to catch someone in free fall. The fall doesn't have to be far. The system just has to have no net. James read that entry 3 times. The system just has to have no net. He turned pages. The entries became more systematic over time. Less personal narrative, more data. Shelter capacity numbers, tracked weekly. Food bank inventory patterns. The specific days and times when services were available versus the days and times when people most needed them, mapped against each other to show the gaps. A man with an engineering mind, unable to stop analyzing the system he was living inside, turning a spiral notebook into the most detailed ground-level study of Chicago's social services infrastructure that James Calloway had ever seen. And James Calloway had funded research on Chicago's social services infrastructure. He had paid consultants. He had read reports. None of them looked like this. The reports his consultants produced were written from the outside, looking in, gathering data through surveys and interviews and census figures, building models of the system as it appeared from a sufficient distance to see its shape. Useful. Accurate, as far as it went. This notebook was written from inside the system. From the position of someone the system was processing. The difference was the difference between a structural analysis done from architectural drawings and a structural analysis done by someone standing inside the building while it was under stress. Both produced data. Only one produced this. James set the notebook down at 2:14 in the morning. He looked at the kitchen table, the table that seated eight, and had seated eight exactly twice in 3 years. He thought about Sarah Mitchell's kitchen table, the small one she had described, almost in passing, during their conversation that morning. The one where Emma did homework. The one where Sarah ran the morning math under the small light above the stove. He thought about Marcus's kitchen table in the Bronzeville house. The one that was someone else's kitchen table now. He picked up the notebook again and turned to the most recent entries. 2 weeks ago, a note about a job fair at a community college on the south side. Marcus had attended, had spoken to 4 employers. 3 had expressed interest until the gap in his employment history came up. 13 years of contract work and shelter addresses and no permanent employer. And the interest had cooled in the specific way that interest cools when a risk calculation produces a number larger than the anticipated benefit. One employer had not asked about the gap, had talked to Marcus for 40 minutes about structural engineering, had taken his number, had not called. James turned to the last entry. 2 days ago, the shelter at capacity, the church that opened at midnight, the temperature calculation. He closed the notebook. He sat for a moment in the silence of the 43rd floor. Then he picked up his phone and called his director of development. It was 2:21 in the morning. Dan Freeman answered on the 3rd ring, the voice of a man who had worked for James Calloway for 11 years and understood that calls at 2 a.m. were not social. "I need the Englewood proposal on my desk at 7, James said. "The full version, not the board presentation, the actual numbers." "It'll be there," Dan said. "What are we looking at?" "I'll tell you at 7, James said. "Get some sleep." He hung up. He sat with the notebook for another few minutes. Then he opened it again to the margin diagram, the closed loop. Arrows going in circles. He took a pen from the kitchen counter. He drew a line that broke the loop, labeled it. Net. At 7 the next morning, James walked into the conference room on the 22nd floor, where Dan Freeman and 3 members of the development team were already seated with the Englewood proposal spread across the table. He set Marcus's notebook on the table in front of him. Nobody said anything about it. "The Englewood project," James said. "Current proposal. 340 units, 10% affordable mixed income, retail on the ground floor. Projected completion 2027. He looked at the numbers. "What are we leaving on the table by keeping affordable units at 10%? Dan looked at the team. By current projections, moving to 30% affordable would reduce projected ROI by approximately 11%. We'd still be profitable, but the margin, that's not what I asked," James said. "I asked what we're leaving on the table." Silence. "What does the community need?" James said. "Not what the market will bear. What does the actual community that will live around this building actually need that this proposal isn't providing?" More silence. The kind of silence that happens when people who are very good at answering specific questions are asked a question they haven't been asked before. James opened the notebook, turned to a section near the middle, slid it across the table to Dan. "This is a structural analysis of Chicago's affordable housing gap," he said, "written by a licensed structural engineer who has been living inside the problem for 13 years. I want you to read the section starting on page 312 and tell me if any of it is reflected in our current proposal." Dan looked at the notebook, looked at James, read. The table was quiet for 6 minutes while Dan read. When he looked up, his expression had done the thing that James had hoped for. The specific recalibration of a professional encountering information that is both new and undeniable. "None of it," Dan said. "None of it is in the proposal." "I know," James said. He looked at the team. "I want to redesign this project," he said. "Not cosmetically, structurally. I want to understand what it would take to build something in Englewood that is designed from the ground level up, based on what the community actually needs, not what we assume they need, not what a market study says they should need, what they actually need." He paused. "And I want the person who wrote that notebook in the room when we do it." He met Marcus for breakfast at 8. Sarah was there too. She had an hour before her shift. They sat at the same corner table as the day before. The notebook on the table between them returned as promised. "I read all of it," James said. "Every page." Marcus looked at him. "And?" he said. And it's the most accurate analysis of Chicago's housing and workforce crisis that I've encountered in 30 years of developing in this city. Marcus said nothing. I want to ask you something, James said. I need you to answer it the way you'd answer an engineering question, not the way you'd answer me. Not the way you'd answer the situation you're in. The way you'd answer the problem itself. Marcus waited. James leaned forward. If you were designing a system, he said, a real one, not patching the one that exists, designing from scratch, what would it need to have that the current one doesn't? The question landed in the air between them. Sarah looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the notebook. Nobody had asked him that. In 13 years of navigating shelters and job fairs, and legal aid offices, and workforce development programs, and every apparatus that the city and state and federal government had constructed to address the problem he was living inside. Not one person who had the power to change any of it had ever sat across from him and asked that question. What would you design instead? Not what do you need right now? Not how can we help you, specifically? Not the question that was really about the person asking it, about their capacity to give, their desire to feel useful, their need to have helped someone. The actual question, about the actual system, asked of the person who knew it best. Marcus opened the notebook to the diagram in the margin, the closed loop with the line through it. Labeled, net. He looked at the handwriting, different from his own. He looked up at James. You drew this. Last night, James said. At 2 a.m., approximately. Marcus looked at the diagram for a moment. Then he turned to a clean page in the back of the notebook. He picked up a pen. First, he said, a net has to catch people before they hit the ground, not after. The current system is reactive. It responds to homelessness, to unemployment, to crisis. By the time someone enters the system, they've already lost the things that made recovery possible. Housing, credit history, professional network, family stability. He drew a horizontal line across the page. The intervention point has to move here. He marked a point earlier on the line. Before the fall, not at the bottom. James's development director was taking notes. Second, Marcus continued. The loop I documented, you need benefits to get housing, you need housing to get benefits. That's a design flaw. It's not an accident. It was built that way because the people who designed it weren't thinking about the person trying to navigate it. They were thinking about the program. He drew the loop, drew a door in it. You break it by creating a single entry point, one intake, one case file. Housing, employment, healthcare, childcare, coordinated from one place instead of requiring the person to navigate 4 separate systems that don't communicate with each other. He kept writing. James kept listening. Sarah kept her coffee cup in both hands and said nothing for the first 40 minutes. Then, when Marcus paused, the employer, she said. Both men looked at her. Everything Marcus is describing is about how people access the system, she said. But the system depends on employers too. And right now, an employer looks at a 13-year gap in someone's employment history, and the math says don't hire them. She looked at James. You hire people. You have 400 employees. What would it take to change how you evaluate that gap? James looked at her. Practically, she said. Not in principle, in the actual hiring decision. James looked at his HR director, who had said nothing for the past hour and was now sitting very straight. Practically, James said, it would require changing what we're measuring. We evaluate candidates based on continuous employment history. That measures conformity to a system, not capability, not knowledge, not the specific skills the job actually requires. Right, Sarah said. If we evaluated capability directly, gave Marcus, for example, a structural engineering problem to solve, and evaluated him on the solution rather than his resume, he'd get the job, Sarah said. Yes, James said. The table was quiet. Marcus looked at the notebook in his hands. Then he looked at James. Nobody ever asked me to solve a problem, he said. Every interview, every application, every interaction with the system for 13 years, nobody ever said, here is a problem, show me what you can do with it. I know, James said. Why not? Marcus said, not bitterly, genuinely. The question of a structural engineer trying to understand a system. The capability doesn't disappear, it's still there. Why doesn't the system look for it? James thought about that. Because the system is designed to process people efficiently, he said finally. And efficiency requires categories. Categories require proxies. Continuous employment history is a proxy for reliability. It's not a measurement of capability. It just correlates with it. Most of the time, for most people, under most conditions. He paused. It doesn't correlate for someone who was reliable and capable and got knocked off the track by a force majeure clause on page 17. The table was quiet again. Page 17, Marcus said quietly. Page 17, James said. Sarah looked between them. So you fix the proxy, she said. You measure the actual thing instead of the proxy for the thing. Yes, James said. And you require your contractors to do the same, she said. Every firm that works with Callaway Group. Same hiring standards. Because one company changing its practices helps some people. One company requiring it across its supply chain, that's different math. James looked at her. Different math, he repeated. I run math every morning, she said. I know the difference between a number that helps one person and a number that changes the equation. James was quiet for a moment. Then, he looked at Marcus, then at Sarah. Two people who had been processed by a system that had never once asked what they could do. I've been asking the wrong question for 30 years, James said. Not to them specifically. To himself, out loud in front of them, which was its own kind of thing. The question I've been asking is, how do we build more? More units, more projects, more development. The question I should have been asking is, what are we building it for? He looked at Marcus's notebook. You've been answering that question for 13 years, he said. In a dollar store notebook, on sidewalks and shelter cots and the floor of a church that opens at midnight. He looked up. I want to ask you to keep answering it, he said, formally. As a consultant on the Englewood project, as an advisor on how Callaway Group structures its contractor relationships going forward, as the person in the room who has the information we don't have. He paused, not charity, work, paid work, at a rate that reflects what the work is actually worth. Marcus looked at him for a long time. And my license? He said. It's lapsed. Licenses can be reinstated, James said. I have attorneys who handle professional licensing. It's paperwork. He paused. It's fixable. That's the thing about most of this. It's fixable. The problems aren't inevitable. They're the result of specific decisions that can be specifically unmade. Marcus looked at the notebook, the diagram, the closed loop, the line breaking through it. Net. He thought about the back patio in Bronzeville. The concrete he had poured himself because he wanted to know what he was standing on. He was sitting on concrete now. Different concrete. Same city. He thought about Andre in Indianapolis, 25 years old. Calling sometimes, the word sometimes carrying everything inside it. He looked at James Callaway. I have one condition, he said. Name it. The notebook, Marcus said. It's not proprietary. It belongs to the people in it. Every person I documented, every story, every closed loop. If this work leads to something real, policy changes, program redesigns, anything that actually moves the intervention point, the people in this notebook have to be part of it, not as subjects, as contributors. The same way you're asking me to contribute. James looked at him. Done, he said, not after consideration. Immediately. Because some things don't require deliberation. Sarah put her coffee cup down. She had 3 minutes until her shift. I have to go, she said. She stood up. She looked at Marcus, then at James. Don't make it complicated, she said. The things Marcus described, the net, the single intake point, the capability-based hiring, those aren't complicated. They're just different. She pulled on her jacket, tugged the left sleeve down over her wrist. Different is hard. But it's not the same as complicated. She picked up her bag. Emma's inhaler, James said. I meant what I said yesterday. That's covered. Starting this month, every month. Sarah looked at him. I'll pay you back, she said. I know you would, James said. I'm not offering a loan. I'm offering a correction. You work in a building I own. Your wages don't cover your daughter's medication. That's a number I'm responsible for. She looked at him for a moment. Okay, she said. One word. No performance of gratitude. No deflection. Just the clean acceptance of a person who knows the difference between charity and correction. She walked out into the Chicago morning. Green uniform, old jacket, left sleeve pulled down. The same steady pace, still here, still moving. The Englewood community meeting was held on a Thursday evening in the basement of a church on 63rd Street. James had arranged it, not through a PR firm, not with a prepared presentation or a branded backdrop or any of the apparatus that usually accompanied Callaway Group's community engagement process. The process his communications team had developed over 20 years. And that was, he had come to understand in the past 72 hours, a very well-produced version of not actually listening. He had asked Marcus to arrange it instead. Marcus had made 12 phone calls over 2 days. The people who showed up on Thursday evening were not the people who usually showed up at developer community meetings. Not the alderman's office, not the neighborhood association leadership, not Calclex selected representatives of community interest whose names appeared in the press releases afterward. They were the people in the notebook. 43 of them. A woman named Dorothy who had lost her apartment when her employer went under. The same Dorothy Marcus had noted in 2012, still in the system, 4 years on a waiting list for subsidized housing that had moved her from position 847 to position 612 in 4 years at the current rate of attrition. She would reach the front of the list in approximately 11 more years. She was currently 68. A man named Roosevelt, who had worked construction for 30 years and lost 3 fingers on a job site in 2015. A job site where the safety protocols that should have prevented the accident had been cut by a contractor trying to meet a margin requirement that had been passed down from the developer above him and the developer above that. Roosevelt had received a workers' compensation settlement that covered 6 months of living expenses. The injury had ended his ability to work in his field. The settlement had run out. A woman named Keisha, 31 years old, who had grown up in the Englewood neighborhood where Callaway Group was planning to build, whose mother had grown up there, whose grandmother had owned a house there, before the neighborhood's tax base had been systematically undermined by the redlining practices of the 1950s and 60s. The formal, federal, documented policy of marking black neighborhoods in red on lending maps and refusing mortgages, which had prevented the generational wealth accumulation that turned homeownership into inheritance, that turned inheritance into stability, that turned stability into the kind of cushion that meant one medical crisis or one job loss didn't spiral into 13 years on the street. Keisha was working 2 jobs and saving for a down payment on an apartment she would not be able to afford in the neighborhood her family had lived in for 3 generations. If Callaway Group built what it was currently planning to build in Englewood, James sat in a folding chair in the basement of the church on 63rd Street and listened. Marcus sat beside him, not translating, not managing, just present in the room he had put together among the people he had documented. James had brought a legal pad. He wrote on it constantly, not notes for a presentation, not data points for a report. He was writing the way he had once, a long time ago, before Callaway Group became the size it was and meetings became the size they were. Writing to understand. Writing because the act of putting something on paper forced a kind of precision that listening alone didn't require. Dorothy spoke first. She spoke for 11 minutes without stopping, in the precise, organized way of someone who had been waiting to say something for a long time and had used that time to put it in the right order. I worked as a bookkeeper for 31 years, she said. The same firm. I know spreadsheets. I know balance sheets. I know how numbers tell stories and how they hide stories depending on which column you put them in. She looked at James. The story your proposal tells is about units. 340 units, 10% affordable. Completion date 2027. That's the story in the column labeled outcomes. She paused. The story in the column nobody labels is about what happens to the people currently living in Englewood when 340 units of mixed income housing appear in their neighborhood, and the property values adjust, and the tax assessments adjust, and the rent on their current apartments adjusts because the market has decided the neighborhood is worth more now. She looked at him. That story doesn't appear in the proposal. But it's real. I've watched it happen in 5 Chicago neighborhoods in the last 20 years. I know what the second column looks like. James wrote on the legal pad, second column, what the proposal doesn't label. Roosevelt spoke next. He held up his right hand. 3 fingers, the thumb and index finger intact, the middle 3 gone at the second knuckle. I'm not here to talk about my hand, he said. I'm here to talk about the contractor who was responsible for the safety protocol that should have prevented it. That contractor was working for a developer. The developer had a margin requirement. The margin requirement came from an investor return expectation. The investor return expectation came from a financial model. He put his hand down. Nobody in that chain made a decision that was illegal. Every decision was rational given the incentive structure. The incentive structure produced my hand. He paused. I want to know what the incentive structure in your contracts looks like, because you can mandate safety compliance. You can make it a condition of the contract, same as timeline and budget. If you make safety compliance a condition and you actually enforce it, not just require it on paper, actually audit it, actually pull contracts when it's violated, the incentive structure changes. The decisions change. He looked at James. That's not complicated. It's just a choice about what you require. James wrote incentive structures, what we mandate versus what we recommend. Keisha was the last to speak. She was 31 years old, and she spoke with the specific, contained anger of someone who had learned to make anger useful rather than just felt. My grandmother bought a house on 64th Street in 1962, she said. She saved for 11 years to do it. She couldn't get a mortgage from any of the banks that operated in this neighborhood because this neighborhood was redlined. Federal government put it on a map and said, this is a black neighborhood and we will not guarantee loans here. So she saved cash, bought the house outright. It was worth $18,000 in 1962. She paused. That house is gone now. My grandmother sold it in 1987 when the neighborhood declined. Declined because of the same policies that prevented investment for 30 years, and then withdrew support when the consequences of that disinvestment became visible. She sold it for $23,000, $1962 to $1987. That's a loss in real terms. She looked at James. If she had been able to buy that house in a neighborhood that was not redlined, if she had been able to access the same wealth-building tools that white families in Chicago were accessing in 1962, that house would be worth $380,000 today. That's the inheritance I didn't get. That's the down payment I don't have. That's why I'm saving from 2 jobs to afford an apartment in the neighborhood my family built. She folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking you to fix 1962, she said. I'm asking you to understand that the neighborhood you're about to develop was made available to you at its current price point because of decisions made in 1962 that nobody in this room made, but everybody in this room is still living inside. She looked at him steadily. What you do with that understanding is your decision. But you should make it knowing what you're building on. The basement was quiet. 43 people. James looked at his legal pad. He had filled 4 pages. He looked at Marcus beside him. Marcus was not looking at him. Marcus was looking at Dorothy, who was looking at the floor with the expression of someone who has said a true thing and is waiting to see if saying it changed anything. It was, James thought, the specific expression of someone who had said true things many times before and had learned not to assume that saying them would be enough. He thought about the photograph on his office wall, the South Loop rendering. 2006. He had been proud of that project, had believed, genuinely, that it was good development. Mixed use, well-designed, bringing investment into an underserved area. He had believed it from 22 floors. He was on the ground floor now. The ground floor looked different, not because the project had been wrong exactly, because it had been incomplete. Had looked at the neighborhood as a site, a location with characteristics and constraints and opportunities, without seeing the neighborhood as a place with Dorothy and Roosevelt and Keisha and their grandmothers and the maps from 1962, and the second column that nobody labeled, and the stories that didn't appear in the proposal but were real. The development had been technically sound. The foundation had been compromised from the start. You could build a structurally perfect building on a compromised foundation. It would still fail. I want to ask you all something, James said. The room turned to him. Not what you need from this project, he said. I've asked that kind of question before, and I know how it works. I ask, you tell me, I take the information back upstairs, and my team produces a modified proposal that incorporates your input in the ways that don't affect the margin and presents it as community-driven development. He paused. I'm not going to do that. The room was very still. I want to ask a different question, he said. If you were designing this project, not what you want me to add to my design, but the project itself, from the beginning, what would it look like? Silence. Dorothy looked up from the floor. You're asking us to design your project? She said. I'm asking you to design a project for your neighborhood, James said. I'll build what you design, within structural and financial constraints that I'll be transparent about. I'll tell you what's possible and what isn't and why. But the design, what it's for, who it serves, what it requires of the people who live near it and in it, that comes from this room. More silence. Roosevelt looked at his three-fingered hand, looked at James. You serious, he said. Not a question. Yes, because developers come down here and ask what we need all the time, Roosevelt said. And then they go back upstairs and build what they were going to build anyway and put a community room in it and call it responsive. I know, James said. So what's different this time? James picked up Marx's notebook from the table in front of him, held it up. This is different, he said. This is 13 years of your neighborhood, documented by someone who was living in it. This is the actual data. Not a survey, not a focus group, not a consultant's report, the real thing. He set it down, and I read all of it. Every page. At 2 in the morning at my kitchen table. He paused. I know what's in the second column. I'm not going to pretend I don't. Dorothy looked at him for a long time. The look of someone deciding something. The house my grandmother lost, Keisha said quietly. The $380,000 she didn't get to pass down. You can't give that back. No, James said. But you could build something in this neighborhood that her granddaughter can afford to live in. Keisha said, that's not reparations. That's just not making the same mistake twice. Yes, James said. And the contractor safety protocols, Roosevelt said, that's a contract requirement. You can put that in writing by Monday. By Monday, James said. Dorothy looked at her hands. The waiting list, she said. Position 612. 11 more years. She looked up. If you're building 340 units and you're asking us to design it, one of the things I'm going to design is a preference system for people currently on the city's affordable housing waiting list. Not a separate building, not a set-aside section. Integrated units, same building, same amenities. And the waiting list people go to the front of the line for those units, not because of charity. Because they've already been waiting 11 years, and that waiting has a cost that should be recognized in who gets access first. James wrote it down. That's in the design, he said. You'll get pushback from the market rate buyers, Dorothy said. They don't want to know who their neighbors are going to be. I'll handle the pushback, James said. How? By building something good enough that the market rate buyers want to be there regardless, James said. Good design doesn't require sorting people. It requires actually designing for people. All of them at every income level, with the same quality and the same care. He paused. That's harder to build. It's not impossible. It just requires deciding it matters. The meeting ran 4 hours. James filled 11 pages of the legal pad. When it was over, when the folding chairs were being stacked and Dorothy was putting on her coat, and Roosevelt was waiting for his ride, and Keisha was checking her phone for the bus time, Marcus came to stand beside James. You know this is going to cost you, he said. The board. The investors. The margin on this project is going to be significantly different from the current proposal. I know, James said. You're going to have to make the case. I know. What's your case going to be? James looked at the legal pad. 11 pages, Dorothy's second column, Roosevelt's incentive structures, Keisha's grandmother's house, the waiting list at position 612. He looked at the notebook in Marcus's hands. My case, James said, is that we've been measuring the wrong things. We measure ROI. We measure units delivered. We measure timeline and budget compliance. He paused. We don't measure what we built on. We don't measure what it cost the people who were already there. We don't measure whether the thing we built actually served the place it was built in or just occupied it. He picked up the legal pad. If I go to my board with a lower margin on this project, they're going to ask me what we get for the difference. And my answer is going to be, we get to actually mean what we say we mean. Marcus looked at him. Nourishing every community, he said. James looked at him. That's a grocery company, he said. I know, Marcus said, but the principle applies. James was quiet for a moment. The principle applies, he said. He looked around the empty basement. Folding chairs stacked against the wall, the long tables, the fluorescent lights that buzzed slightly, the specific sound of a room that had held something important and was now returning to itself. He thought about 43 people who had come to a church basement on a Thursday evening because Marcus had made 12 phone calls, who had sat in folding chairs and told the truth about the second column to a man who owned the building outside which Marcus had been sitting as. When Sarah Mitchell stopped, he thought about Sarah. 12 hours behind a register, $37 until Friday. The left sleeve pulled down over the gap in the lining. Still here, still moving, still running the math. He thought about Emma's inhaler. He took out his phone and sent an email to his HR director. Wage review. All hourly workers in Callaway Group owned properties, including contracted service workers. I want to know what everyone is making and what it would cost to bring the floor to a living wage across the board. On my desk Monday, he sent it, put the phone away, picked up his coat. Come to the office tomorrow, he said to Marcus. 8 o'clock. Bring the notebook. We're starting the redesign. Marcus looked at him. My license, he said. My attorneys are already on it, James said. Paperwork was filed this morning. Provisional reinstatement pending review should be 90 days. Marcus was quiet. 90 days, he said. 90 days, James confirmed. Marcus looked at the notebook. 13 years of documentation. 847 pages. Every closed loop, every gap, every person the system had processed and left in positions 6 and 12 on a waiting list or on the concrete outside a glass tower or behind a cash register at midnight in a building that didn't pay a living wage. All of it. Still here. 8 o'clock, Marcus said. The board meeting was on a Monday. James had asked for 2 hours. His CFO had suggested one was probably sufficient for what appeared, from the pre-read materials, to be a straightforward proposal modification. James had said 2 hours and sent the pre-read materials, which were not what his CFO had expected. The materials were 47 pages. The first 3 pages were the modified Englewood proposal. 340 units, 30% affordable housing integrated throughout the building, not segregated into a separate section, not distinguished by finish quality or amenity access. Same building, same materials, same view from every floor. Pages 4 through 14 were the wage analysis his HR director had delivered Friday morning. James had read it twice. Callaway Group owned or managed 23 commercial properties in Chicago. In those properties, 847 workers were employed through contracted service firms, cleaning, security, food service, facilities maintenance. Of those 847 workers, 612 were earning below Chicago's living wage threshold of $21.34 per hour. The gap between what they were currently paid and what a living wage required totaled $4. $2 million annually across all contracted workers. $2 million. Against a quarterly profit of $340 million. He had stared at those two numbers for a long time. Then he had written a third number beneath them. 2%. 1.2% of quarterly profit to close the wage gap for every contracted worker in every Callaway Group property in Chicago. He had put that page at the front of the board materials. Pages 15 through 31 were excerpts from Marcus's notebook, selected by Marcus himself, with the permission of the people documented in each entry. Not the most dramatic entries, the most specific ones, the ones with the clearest data. Dorothy's waiting list progression, Roosevelt's contractor safety analysis, the closed-loop diagram, the specific, documented evidence of a system producing predictable, measurable outcomes that were not being measured by anyone with the power to change them. Pages 32 through 47 were the redesigned Englewood project proposal, not the modification of the original. A new design, produced over 4 days by James's development team working alongside Marcus and 2 community representatives from Thursday's meeting. Dorothy, who had spent 31 years as a bookkeeper and understood financial modeling, and Keisha, who had grown up in Englewood and understood what the neighborhood needed in a way that no external consultant could replicate. The new design was more expensive to build. It was also, according to the financial model James's team had produced over the weekend, more durable. Mixed income communities with genuine economic integration. Not affordable units in a separate wing, not a set-aside that market-rate buyers could pretend didn't exist. Had measurably lower vacancy rates, lower maintenance costs over time, and stronger long-term appreciation. The data was from studies James had read before, studies his team had read before, studies that had been available for years and had not changed a single project design because the short-term margin on the alternative was higher, and short-term margin was what got measured. The long-term number was better. Nobody had been looking at the long-term number. The board arrived at 9 o'clock. 8 members around the walnut table, combined net worth that James had never calculated and didn't intend to. People he had worked with for years, some for decades, who were good at what they did and had built Callaway Group alongside him into something significant. He looked at them across the table. He thought about Marcus's notebook. He thought about 43 people in a church basement. He thought about Dorothy in position 612. He put the materials on the table. Before we go through the proposal, he said, I want to tell you something that happened last week, not as context for the numbers, as the reason the numbers exist. He told them about the window, about the woman who stopped, about Marcus Webb and Page, 17 and $340,000 and 13 years, and a spiral notebook bought at a dollar store on Milwaukee Avenue that contained the most accurate analysis of Chicago's housing crisis that James Callaway had encountered in 30 years of developing in this city. He did not perform the story. He did not make it inspiring. He told it the way Marcus had described load-bearing failures, precisely, specifically, without embellishment, letting the structure of it make its own argument. The board was quiet when he finished. His CFO, Raymond Park, 62 years old, Harvard MBA, the man who had been managing Callaway Group's finances for 18 years, and who James trusted more than almost anyone in the organization, looked at the materials in front of him. Page 1, Raymond said. The wage gap. 2 million annually. He looked up. You're proposing to close this in the current fiscal year? Yes. The contracted workers aren't our employees, said Diana Chen, the board member who oversaw legal and compliance. Wage levels are set by the service firms. Our contracts specify service requirements, not compensation. Our contracts can specify compensation minimums, James said. We've never required it. We can require it going forward. The service firms will increase their rates to cover the difference. Yes, the cost passes to us, I know. He looked at her. The cost is $2 million on $340 million quarterly profit. That's the math. Diana was quiet. The Englewood redesign, Raymond said, turning pages. You're projecting a 9% reduction in ROI on this project. Correct. That's significant. It is, James said. I want to show you a different number. He turned to the long-term analysis. Comparable mixed-income integrated developments in Chicago over a 15-year horizon show 34% stronger appreciation than comparable single-income developments. The short-term margin is lower. The long-term return is higher. He paused. We've been optimizing for the wrong timeline. Raymond looked at the numbers. The room was quiet in the specific way of people doing math. The notebook, said Thomas Okafor, the board's eldest member, 71, had known James since the earliest Callaway Group days, had been on the board since year 3. He was looking at the excerpts. This engineer, Marcus Webb, yes. He's the subcontractor from the South Loop project, yes. Thomas looked at the page in front of him, the closed loop diagram, the line through it, the word net in James's handwriting. You drew this, Thomas said. At 2 in the morning, James said. Yes. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. I've been on this board for 28 years, he said. In that time, I've watched James Callaway make decisions that seemed wrong and turned out right. I've watched him push through proposals that the room wasn't ready for and turn out to be ahead of the curve. He set the page down. This is different. How is it different? James asked. Those decisions were about the market, Thomas said. This one is about something else. He looked at the materials. This is about what we owe. The room was still. What we owe, James said. Yes, that's not language we typically use in this room, Diana said. I know, James said. I think we should start. The vote was 6-2 in favor. Raymond was one of the 2. He came to James afterward, when the others had filed out, and stood at the window. The east window, the one with the view James had been standing at, when he saw Sarah stop on the sidewalk below. I voted no, Raymond said. I want you to know why. Tell me, James said. Not because the numbers are wrong, Raymond said. The 15-year analysis is sound. The wage correction is manageable. The integrated housing data is real. He paused. I voted no because this is going to require every project from now on to carry this weight, not just Englewood. Every project. Once you establish that Callaway Group builds this way, integrated, living wage, contractor safety mandates, you can't build the other way anymore. The standard is set. He looked at James. I want to make sure you know that's what you're deciding, not just Englewood. Everything. James looked at the east window. At Chicago below, fully awake in the mid-morning light. I know, he said. And you're sure? I'm sure. Raymond nodded slowly. Then I'll make it work financially, he said. That's my job. If you're sure about the direction, I'll make the numbers support it. He paused. But James, the wage correction, the contracted workers. You know Sarah Mitchell is one of them. James looked at him. I know, he said. You know it looks like what it is, James said. A correction. For 847 workers, 612 of whom are earning below a living wage in buildings I own. The fact that I happen to know one of their names doesn't change that any of the other 611 deserve the same thing. He paused. If anything, it means I should have known all their names a long time ago. Raymond was quiet for a moment. All right, he said. He picked up his materials. At the door, he stopped. The notebook, he said. The engineer's notebook. Do you still have it? Marcus has it, Raymond said. It should stay with him. He left. James stood alone in the conference room. He looked at the legal pad on the table. 11 pages from Thursday's church basement. Dorothy's second column. Roosevelt's three-fingered hand. Keisha's grandmother's house. He looked at the one remaining page of board materials on the table. The page he hadn't put in the pre-read. The one he had decided at the last moment to hold back in present only if the vote went the right way. He picked it up now. It was a one-page summary of a new initiative. Not a program, not a fund. A structural change to how Callaway Group evaluated and awarded contracts. Capability-based evaluation. For all subcontractor bids going forward, technical capability would be assessed through demonstrated work. A problem presented, a solution evaluated, rather than exclusively through continuous employment history. The employment gap that had prevented Marcus Webb from re-entering his field for 13 years would no longer be an automatic disqualifier in any Callaway Group contract process, and every major contract would require the contractor to adopt the same standard for their own hiring. One company, one supply chain, different math. He folded the page and put it in his jacket pocket. Then he picked up his phone and called Marcus. The board approved it, he said. All of it. Silence on the other end. The wage correction goes into effect 1st of next month, James continued. All contracted workers in Callaway properties. Living wage floor, no exceptions. He paused. The Englewood redesign is approved. We break ground in spring. Your name is on the structural team. More silence. Marcus, James said. I heard you. His voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man who had learned, over 13 years, to manage the distance between what he hoped and what actually happened. The distance had just closed. Your license reinstatement, James said. The attorneys say 90 days was conservative. It could be 60. They're expediting. 60 days, Mark, 60 days. A pause. Andre, Mark said, not to James. To himself quietly the name of his son, 25 years old in Indianapolis. The word sometimes carrying everything it had been carrying for 15 years. James said nothing. Let the silence be what it was. Thank you, Marcus said finally. This is your work, James said. 847 pages, 13 years. The closed loop and the line through it. I'm building what you designed. We're building what we designed, Marcus said. Dorothy, Roosevelt, Keisha. 43 people on Thursday. This isn't mine. No, James said. It's not. He looked out the east window. Chicago below. The corner of Michigan and Van Buren visible from up here. The spot where 4 days ago, a woman in a green uniform had stopped walking and looked at a man on the concrete and opened her wallet. One more thing, James said. Sarah. What about her? She said she didn't need anything from me, James said. She said she'd pay back the inhaler. She would, Marcus said. I know she would. James paused. I'm not offering her charity. I want to offer her a choice. The wage correction covers her base. But I want to offer her something else. The chance to be part of what we're building in Englewood, not as a token. As someone who has run the math from the inside every morning for 6 years and understands what it produces. She works a 12-hour shift, Marcus said. I know. This would be an addition only if she wanted it. Flexible. On her terms. He paused. The Englewood project needs people who understand what it's like to make the numbers work from the bottom. People who know what a living wage actually means to a person who doesn't have one. That knowledge isn't academic. It's not in any report my consultants have produced. It's in the notebook, Marcus said. It's in the notebook, James agreed. And it's in the way she answered my question on Friday morning. Which question? I asked what made her stop, James said. She said she looked at your hands. She said she could see you were still there, still present. He paused. She said she recognized it. Marcus was quiet. She knew what it cost to stay present, James said. That's not information I can buy. That's not a credential I can find on a resume. He looked at the east window. That's someone who has been doing the thing every day, under conditions that would justify stopping, and hasn't stopped. The line was quiet for a moment. I'll talk to her, Marcus said. No pressure. Just tell her what you said. Tell her it's her choice, James said. Completely. No obligation, no expectation. He paused. Tell her I'm asking because she earned the right to be asked, not because of what she gave you, because of what she knows. I'll tell her, Marcus said. They said goodbye. James put the phone down. He stood at the east window for a long time. The city below in full morning movement, the flow and pattern of it, the choreography of 100,000 people going where they needed to go, doing what they needed to do, running their own math under their own kitchen lights before 5 in the morning. He had been watching this view for 12 years. He'd started 4 days ago to actually see it. The difference was not in the window. The window had always been the same. The difference was in what he was looking for. He picked up Marcus's notebook. Marcus had left it with him for the board meeting, would pick it up this afternoon, and turn to the margin diagram one more time. The closed loop, the line through it. Net. He had drawn that line at 2 in the morning. He was building it now. There is a number that appears in the United States Department of Housing and Urban Development's annual report on homelessness, 580,466. That is the number of people who were experiencing homelessness on a single night in January 2023. Not over the course of the year, on one specific night. The night a federal agency sent out counters to shelters and streets and encampments across every state in the country to count the people sleeping outside the boundaries of a permanent home. 580,466 people. That is roughly the population of Kansas City, Missouri. Every person in Kansas City, the people in the houses and the apartments and the condos and the hospital beds and the nursing homes and the college dormitories transplanted onto the streets of America on one January night. Marcus Webb was one of those people. He was not a statistic when he was one of those people. He was a structural engineer with 847 pages of precise documentation and an expired Illinois engineering license and a leather wallet with a membership card he could not bring himself to throw away. He was a father who had told his 10-year-old son, "You're going to be all right," while watching him drive away, and had not been sure it was true. He was a man who had poured his own back patio because he wanted to know what he was standing on, and who had pressed his hand flat against that concrete on the last morning, before it became someone else's patio, and had felt it still solid beneath his palm. He was all of those things at the same time that he was a number in a federal report. Both were true. The number erases the first set of truths. That is what numbers do when they are large enough. They create the comfortable distance of scale. The sense that the problem is too vast for any individual action to address. The implicit permission to look at the statistic and feel appropriately troubled, and then turn the page. Sarah Mitchell did not turn the page. She did not have the option of scale. She did not have the comfortable distance of 22 floors of glass between herself and the man on the concrete. She was at street level. Same temperature, same wind, same Chicago November, running the same kind of math he had once run every morning from a different position in the same city. She stopped. Not because she had enough. She did not have enough. 47 and a gap in the lining of her jacket, and an inhaler refill due Wednesday and rent due Friday, and a left knee that had started talking to her at hour 8. She stopped because she recognized something. That is the thing about Sarah Mitchell that is not in any federal report and not on any balance sheet and not in any of the metrics that James Calloway's company had been measuring for 30 years. She recognized Marcus Webb as still present, still here, still trying, and she understood in the body, in the bone, what that cost. She gave him $10. She walked 7 kilometers home. She did not regret it. There are things that the data shows clearly about the situation Marcus Webb lived inside for 13 years. The first is this. The financial crisis of 2008 did not affect everyone equally. It affected black households at roughly twice the rate of white households, measured in foreclosures, measured in business failures, measured in wealth destroyed. Not income lost, wealth destroyed. The kind of loss that compounds across generations because wealth is not just what you have. It is what you can pass down and what you can use as collateral and what gives you the cushion to absorb a shock without falling. The foreclosure rate in black neighborhoods in Chicago between 2008 and 2012 was 3 times higher than in comparable white neighborhoods. 3 times. That is not a market force in the neutral sense. That is the result of decades of policy decisions that determined which neighborhoods received investment and which received extraction, which homeowners had access to conventional mortgages and which were steered toward the subprime products that failed first and worst in the crisis, which small businesses could access capital on reasonable terms and which could not. Marcus Webb's company failed because of a force majeure clause on page 17 of a contract. The force majeure clause was the mechanism. The conditions that made the clause catastrophic for Webb Structural Engineering and survivable for Callaway Group. The difference in capital reserves, the difference in access to bridge financing, the difference in the cushion that meant one bad quarter was manageable rather than fatal. Those conditions did not arise from nowhere. They arose from the second column. The column nobody labeled. The column Dorothy had been keeping in her own head for 31 years of bookkeeping. The second thing the data shows clearly. The problem is not a shortage of capable people. Marcus Webb's engineering license lapsed in 2009. His knowledge did not lapse. The mathematics of load-bearing structures did not become unavailable to him because his license had expired. The 22 years of expertise he had built, the kind of expertise that produces the specific, practical precision of someone who has solved real problems on real sites under real constraints. That knowledge was in him, intact, on every morning he woke up in a shelter or on a sidewalk or in the room of a boarding house. Nobody asked him to use it, not because there was no need for it. Chicago was building, developing, constructing structures that required exactly the kind of structural engineering knowledge Marcus had. The demand for that expertise was real and continuous. The pathway back to participating in that demand was closed, not by law, by practice, by the proxy of continuous employment history that stood in for capability assessment, because capability assessment was harder and proxies were efficient. Efficient for whom? Efficient for the people doing the hiring, not for the people being evaluated. Not for the city that needed the expertise, not for the economy that was systematically excluding qualified professionals because their qualification had been interrupted by circumstances beyond their control. The proxy was efficient in the short term for the person not having to conduct a capability assessment. The cost was paid by everyone else. Marcus had documented this. 847 pages. The specific cumulative cost of a system that evaluated proxies rather than capabilities, that processed people rather than seeing them, that produced the closed loop and called it market forces. He had not stopped documenting. He had not stopped understanding. He had not stopped being a structural engineer in the only place it had been available to him, in his own head, running calculations that nobody was asking for, in a notebook that nobody was reading, until somebody sat down on the concrete beside him and asked. The third thing, what Sarah Mitchell did on the corner of Michigan and Van Buren was not remarkable in the sense of being unusual for a person of her character. It was remarkable in the sense of being rare in a system designed to make it rare. The system the economic system, the social system, the, the physical design of cities that puts the people with the least in the positions with the least visibility from the positions of power is not designed to produce moments where a person at street level and a person on the 22nd floor are confronted with each other's actual humanity at the same time. The glass is thick. The distance is real. The system produces the distance deliberately, not through malice, but through the accumulated logic of decisions made by people optimizing for efficiency at every individual level. Each decision rational given the incentive structure. The incentive structure producing, in aggregate, a city where 580,466 people sleep outside on a January night and the rest of us see a number in a federal report. Sarah Mitchell did not have the distance. She was at street level. She stopped. That is all. And from that stopping, from the specific, unescalable, entirely human act of one person at street level, recognizing another person at street level as still present, still here, still trying, came a chain of events that produced a board vote and a wage correction and a redesigned building and a provisional engineering license reinstatement and 43 people in a church basement on a Thursday night. Finally, being asked the question nobody had asked, the chain was not inevitable. It required James at the window at that specific moment. It required Marcus to have kept the notebook. It required Sarah to stop rather than keep walking, as every other person who had passed that corner that night had kept walking. Contingent, fragile, dependent on a series of specific human choices that could have gone differently at every step. That is the argument for despair. It is also, read differently, the argument for the opposite, because the chain started with $10. With a woman who had $47 and a gap in her jacket lining and a daughter's inhaler due Wednesday, and who looked at a man on concrete and recognized him and did not calculate whether she could afford to stop. She stopped. The $10 did not change Marcus Webb's housing situation. It did not restore his company, or his marriage, or the 15 years, or his son growing up in another city. It did not change the force majeure clause on page 17, or the closed loop, or position 612 on Dorothy's waiting list. It changed one night. One night was warmer. One man felt seen. One man who had been documenting a system for 13 years in a dollar store notebook was looked at by a stranger with eyes that registered him as still present, as a person rather than a statistic, as someone whose continued presence in the world was worth $10 of bus fare on a cold November night. And from that, not inevitably, not mechanically, but through the specific contingent chain of human choices that followed, a man on the 22nd floor put on his coat and went downstairs. There is a question that gets asked about Sarah Mitchell's choice, once people know what followed from it. The question is, did she know? Did she know, when she stopped, that the man on the concrete had a notebook and a story and a chain of connections that would lead to a board meeting and a wage correction and a redesigned building? She did not. She knew nothing. She knew only what she could see from street level in 4 degrees below zero at 10 o'clock on a Wednesday night in November. A man, still present, a cold night, $10 in her wallet. That was the full extent of her knowledge when she made the decision. This is the most important fact in the story. Not what followed, what preceded. She gave without knowing. She stopped without certainty of outcome. She acted on what she could see. A person who needed something she had, without calculation of return, without knowledge of consequence, without any of the information that would have made the decision strategically rational. She acted from something older and simpler and harder to name than strategy. She acted from recognition, from the understanding that the man on the concrete was still here and that still here mattered, and that she had something to give, and that the math, the morning math, the survival math, the $47 and the gap in the lining, and the inhaler due Wednesday was real and true, and also insufficient to be the only thing that determined what she did. The math was real. The math was not everything. The American story about poverty is almost always told as a story about individual failure, about choices made, about paths not taken, about the specific moral or practical failures that explain why a particular person ended up in a particular difficult position. The story is not wrong that individual choices matter. It is wrong that individual choices are sufficient to explain outcomes. Marcus Webb made good choices. He worked, he built, He employed people, he paid fairly, he kept his records. He showed up every day to a profession he had devoted his life to, and did it well enough that clients called him back and referrals came unsolicited. And the engineers who worked for him stayed because they were learning something they couldn't learn anywhere else. He made all the right choices. Page 17 happened anyway. The closed loop was there waiting for him when he fell. The net was not. That is not a story about individual failure. That is a story about system design. Systems are designed by people. Systems can be redesigned by people. The choices about what to require in a contract, what to measure in a hiring process, what to build, and for whom, and at what price point, and with what mandatory standards for the workers who build it. Those choices are made by specific people in specific rooms on specific Mondays. James Calloway made different choices on a Monday. Because a woman stopped on a Wednesday night. Because a man kept a notebook for 13 years. Because somebody finally asked the question nobody had asked. Sarah Mitchell still works the morning shift. Her wages went up on the first of the month, not dramatically, $4.86 an hour. The difference between what she had been making and the living wage floor that Callaway Group's new contractor standards require, $4.86 an hour, a 40-hour week over 52 weeks, is $10,099 on a year. $10.99 a year is Emma's inhaler cover. Is the electric bill paid on time? Is the morning math producing a different answer? Is not everything. Is not the correction for 30 years of policy decisions, or the second column, or the accumulated distance between the 22nd floor and the sidewalk. But it is $10,099 a year. And $10,099 a year is the difference for Sarah Mitchell and Emma between the math that doesn't have a good answer and the math that has one she can work with. She still pulls the left sleeve down over the gap in the jacket lining every morning. The jacket is 3 years old, and the lining is not getting better. She has not replaced it yet, not because she can't. Because some habits take longer to let go of than the circumstances that created them. That is also true. The habits of scarcity outlast the scarcity itself. The body that learned to run the survival math every morning does not immediately stop running it just because the numbers have improved. The woman who walked 7 kilometers in 4 degrees below zero because she gave away her bus fare does not immediately believe in the body that next month there will be bus fare. That belief comes slowly. It comes with time and with consistency and with the specific repeated experience of the math producing a different answer. It is coming. Marcus Webb moved into a studio apartment in Pilsen on the 15th of the month. First floor, south-facing windows. A small kitchen with a gas stove that worked and a bathroom where all the fixtures functioned without negotiation. He stood in the empty apartment on the first day with his 2 bags and the notebook and the old leather wallet and looked around at the space. He was a structural engineer. He could not help reading the apartment the way he read everything. The load-bearing walls, the quality of the original construction, the evidence of what the building had been through in its history, visible in the small repairs and modifications that had accumulated over decades. Good bones, he thought. Original construction sound. The repairs were honest. Not cosmetic cover-ups, but actual fixes, done by someone who understood what was wrong and addressed it rather than concealing it. He set his bags down. He put his hand flat against the wall. Solid. He was standing on something solid, not his own. Not yet. But solid. He stood like that for a moment, hand flat against the wall, feeling the specific irreducible fact of a structure that had been built to hold weight and was holding it. Then he took the notebook out of his bag. He opened it to a new page. He wrote the date at the top. Below it he wrote, day 1. Below that he wrote nothing. Some pages take time to fill. He had time. James Calloway had dinner with his daughter on a Friday. She had flown in from New York for the weekend, not because of anything specific, just because they had been talking more lately, since the board meeting, since the church basement, since the conversation at 2 in the morning when he had called her and said something he hadn't said in years. I think you were right. She had been right about the question he was asking. She had said for years that he was building things. She had been asking why. He had been answering with the thing that was easy to answer. The market analysis, the financial projections, the 30 years of correct theories about which neighborhoods were undervalued. She had been asking something older. What are you building it for? He did not have a complete answer yet. He was closer to one than he had been a week ago. They ate at the small table in the kitchen nook, not the formal dining table that seated 8. The small one, the one his ex-wife had sat at with her morning coffee, the one that he had avoided for years because the empty chair across it was louder than any boardroom silence. His daughter sat in that chair. It did not feel empty anymore. They talked about the project, about Marcus, about Thursday's church basement, about the 43 people and the second column and position 612, and Roosevelt's fingered hand, and Keisha's grandmother's house. His daughter listened the way she always listened when something mattered. Completely, without the half-presence that conversations about his work had carried for years. You sound different, she said. Different how? She thought about it. You sound like you're building something, she said, not just something you can measure. He looked at his daughter across the small table. I am, he said. She smiled. It was, he thought, the best dinner he had had in a very long time. The kitchen smelled like food, and the table was full, and the city outside the window was doing the thing it did at night, becoming its diagram version, the clean lines and predictable flows, the efficient movement of a place that worked. He knew now what was underneath the diagram. He was going to keep knowing. 6 months later, the corner of Michigan and Van Buren looked exactly the same. Same concrete, same street lamp, same building rising 22 floors above the sidewalk where it happened. Corners don't mark themselves, but the people do. 3 windows still lit that evening across Chicago. A studio in Pilsen, Marcus at a kitchen table, notebook open to a new page, a reinstated license in his pocket, a foundation he helped design breaking ground that morning. He put his hand flat on the table, solid. He picked up the pen. An apartment 6 miles south, Sarah at her own kitchen table, Emma asleep, the new jacket by the door, the Englewood project folder open in front of her. The morning math would come back at 4:47. It always would. But the answer it produced now was different. Workable, a number she could build from. The 22nd floor, James at the east window, looking at the same view he'd looked at for 12 years. Same glass, same distance, different eyes. He turned off the light, took the elevator down, walked out onto the sidewalk, stopped at the corner of Michigan and Van Buren, put his hand flat against the glass wall of his own building. Cold, solid, still standing. He kept walking. The $10 didn't fix the system. It didn't restore what Marcus lost, or give Dorothy back the 11 years she waited, or return Keisha's grandmother's house, or undo page 17. It did one thing. It reminded a man on concrete that someone saw him. Still here, still present, still worth stopping for. And from that, one person recognized by one person on one corner on one cold night, a chain of choices followed that was not inevitable and not guaranteed and entirely dependent on specific human beings deciding, one at a time, to stop looking at a diagram and start looking at a city. The system doesn't change by itself. It changed because someone stops, because someone looks, because someone with $47 in their wallet and a gap in their jacket lining and a daughter's inhaler due Wednesday decides that the math, real as it is, true as it is not the only thing that gets to determine what they do. Sarah Mitchell stopped on a Wednesday night. Everything that followed was built on that. If this story stayed with you, subscribe if you're new, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and tell me in the comments, when was the last time you stopped? I read every one.